Hello, students. This is Professor B, Business 131. I want to discuss today with you Chapter 20's Exercise 20-11. It's a different problem that we have looked at previously, and it is an essential problem in this chapter. So we'll cover that. But before I get that far, I want to discuss the differences between the process cost system that we learned in this chapter compared to the previous chapter. We were discussing job costing. You see, in job costing, we have clearly identified projects we're working on, and when we complete a project, we move it to finished goods inventory. However, in process costing, each item is indistinguishable from the other item. And so we need a way to account for the costs associated with these items. The best way we do that is by looking at each department individually. You see, we can't take a look at these items individually because they're all identical, and we need a way to clearly segregate them. So what we do is we take a look at each department which receives direct materials generally in the beginning of the process, and then direct labor is added to it, and then in a conducive environment known as factory overheads, and we're able to complete the process and move it on or transfer it on to the next department. And so what we need to do in this problem in exercise 20-11 is we need to take a look at a specific department, determine the items that were placed in production or in process at the beginning of the process, and how many units we added direct material, or we added direct labor, or we added factory overheads to. Process costing, things are a bit different. In process costing, all of the product is similar in nature. It's not unique, and so we can't segregate cleanly what each project um, ensues or entails, right? We have a situation where all product is the same, and so we need a different way of computing the cost. And in process costing, we'll employ something called cost of production report. We'll take a look at that in this problem. But basically, in process costing, we receive materials, we use direct labor and factory overheads, and we mix the items in one department, and then it gets transferred to the next department where it's packaged up. Then it moves on to the next department where it is stacked away in some sort of a secure facility. Because of the difference in these two different types of costing methods, we can no longer take a look at each individual unit and consider its cost. What we need to do is take a look at the entire department, and we need to account for what happened in that department. Anything, if anything was left over, or if anything was there previously, we need to account for those things too. That's a subject of exam or exercise 20-11. So in exercise 20-11, they are talking to us about work in process in the assembly department, just one department for a period. And they've given us a bunch of information as to the direct materials that were there, direct materials that were brought in this period, and then whatever was left over. And then we kind of have to compute that as well. So let's get started with this problem. And I hope that by the end of it, you'll have a clearer idea of what equivalent units are, what whole units are, and so on. Before we get that far, let's take a look at part A in this problem, where it talks about or asks us to calculate the number of units in work in process inventory at the end of the period. Notice there's a question mark here. They don't actually tell us, and we have to compute that. So I want you to take a look at your template and click on part A, units in process at the beginning of period. They actually tell us that there are 900 units that were unfinished in the last period, so they become the beginning balance this period. And in part A, all we need to do is determine the number of units. I just want you to forget about the cost associated with any of this stuff. Just worry about units in part A. The second line asks us to determine the units placed in production during the period. Well, They tell us that too. Here at 16,000 units were placed in this period, right? That's the debit, because we realize that we credit materials and we debit work in process when we transfer things. So that basically means 16,000 there. Units units finished during the period. That information again is given to us as a credit this time to the assembly department's work in processes T account, where anytime we move things out, we credit. So that's 16,000 to 60 here. All right. So if you had these units, if you had these units, if you had 900 in the beginning and the new units added were 16,000, it would stand to reason that you had 16,900 units available. Then, if you finished 16,260 of them, that would mean that the remainder were still in process or not done. So that's the first thing you want to do, is you want to add up the sum total here, subtract from it the red, right? These are the units in process at the end of the period. They didn't give us that information, so we had to calculate it. The next part in this problem asks us to take a look at part B and determine the equivalent units of production for direct material and conversion. What the heck does that mean? Well, folks, before we get that far, you need to understand what whole units are. Whole units are the number of units in a production during a period, whether they're complete or not. Equivalent units are the portion of whole units that are complete with respect to either material or conversion costs. Conversion costs are simply direct labor and factory overhead put together. In other words, raw material isn't going to convert itself to a final product. You'd have to apply direct labor and factory overheads. And the reason we're doing all of this is because the direct material and conversion costs are applied at different times. That's why we need this method of segregating. Okay, we have our whole units, but out of those, there are some units that are finished as far as direct material is concerned. And you'll notice that up here, it says all direct materials are placed in process at the beginning of the production. Or some of those whole units are not complete as to the conversion process. Okay, so, and still, this may not be perfectly clear to you. And I think we're going to need to go through this example to help us with that. Let's go step by step. In part B, we have to compute again, we're looking at units only right now. I want you to forget everything pertaining to costs. Just let's deal with units. They ask us in B to identify the whole units, the number of whole units that are in process at the beginning of the period. Again, this information is something we just computed up here, so I'm just going to jot that down here. We don't care whether these units are completed as far as direct material is concerned or conversion costs are concerned. We don't care. We just want to account for all of the units in this column. In the next column is where we're going to take a look at how much of direct material or conversion costs were applied to those units. Well, if these items were in process at the beginning of the period, 900 units were in process at the beginning of the period. In this period, did we add any direct material to those 900 units? And the answer is no, because all direct materials were placed in the process at the beginning of the production. So let's say we're making paper airplanes, just as an example, and all of the material we needed to make those paper airplanes were placed in the process at the beginning of production. That means they're already there. The papers are already there in place, and some work needs to be done on them to make them from a paper to a plane. So we don't need to add any more paper. And so thus the answer for this period is 0 as far as direct materials are concerned. In other words, how much more direct material did you have to add to those items in the beginning? that were already there? None, because they were already added in the previous period. So the answer here is simply 0. Then they ask us, okay, out of those 900 pieces, how many pieces did you apply conversion cost to? In other words, how many of those pieces needed direct labor or needed some factory overheads? And this information is given right here in this bit where it says 35% completed. So if you had 900 paper airplanes, out of which 35 were completely done, would you have to apply any more direct labor or any more factory overheads to those 35% completed? And the answer is no, right? If something is complete, you're done. You don't need to add anything to it. And we also know that direct materials were placed at the beginning of the process, so none of the direct materials were needed. What was needed, though, was to finish the remainder, not the 35%, but 1 minus 35% or 65%. In other words, of the pieces in inventory and process at the beginning, 65% need conversion cost, right? Because if they're completed, 35%, then what is not completed must be the other complement. 1 minus 35 is 65%. So out of the 900 pieces, 65 are yet to be completed. Out of the 900 units, 585 units excuse me, thus need some sort of direct labor or some sort of factory overhead. And at this point, we don't care about what that amount or cost is. We just want to identify, as far as units are concerned, how much more conversion we need on those. And that's 585, which is simply 900 minus times 65%, the complement of 35. Okay, so what's next? Next, they want us to determine the number of units that were started and completed this period. And they don't give us this information directly. So what I typically do is I just jump on over to the next cell, transfer to finished goods, because it's easier and it'll help us with the previous item we skipped over. Do we know the number of units that were transferred to finished goods, irrespective of whether they needed something or not, right? So the number of units that were transferred to finished goods, We know that because the number of units that were transferred to finished goods was a credit given to us here, 16,260. So I'm going to go ahead and jot that down here. And in just a second, this will make a whole lot of sense. All right, transferred to finished goods. These were sent out of our department, whatever that department is, assembly department. 16,260 units were transferred out of this department. We know we had 900 in the beginning. So if you had 900 in the beginning of the process and you transferred 16,260 out, then that means the difference between the two must have been added or started in this period. This is what must have been added this period and completed this period, because the previous items were already there and we got rid of, or we transferred 16,260 out of it. That's why I typically skip this line. I just jump on over here and then I back out and I determine what was started and completed this period. Started and completed this period. So not the previous stuff, what was started and completed this period and what was transferred out. Assumes that these pieces, all of them, were finished during this period. And so they were moved to finished goods. All right, let's back up to row 45 now. If we started and completed 15,360 units this period, how much direct material would have been added? Again, we add all direct material at the beginning of the period. So if these items were started at the beginning of the period, then all of these units needed direct material. What about conversion cost? Yep, same thing. They would have needed conversion costs as well, right, to complete them. You see, the reason we're breaking out all of these units into the constituent parts of direct material versus conversion is because some of these units needed direct material, like these right here, and some of these units needed everything. So we just want to break them out because we later will be able to determine the cost of direct material given and cost of conversion again given, which is direct labor and factory overheads. So we just want to determine the number of units that belong in each of these columns so we could determine their total cost down the road. But for now, stay with me. Let's continue to determine the number of units. All right. So for row 46, we just need to add up the totals here and the totals here. What does that mean to us? That means that out of the 16,260 units that were transferred out of this department, 15,360 of them needed direct material. Makes sense because the previous ones already had direct material, so they wouldn't need direct material anymore. And out of the 16,260, 15,945 needed some sort of conversion cost, whether they needed direct labor or factory overhead or both. Again, irrelevant at this point because we know that it's not direct material. So we'll put that together here and continue onwards. Okay, so next they want us to determine the inventory in process. As far as whole units are concerned, well, we already know that there were 640 items or units in process at the end of the period. So I'll just plug that in here. 640 units total were in process at the end of the period, irrespective of whether they needed some direct labor or not, direct material or factory overhead or not, right? Total units. Out of those 640 units, how much of them needed direct material? Well, if we started on these items during the period, would they have received direct material? And the answer is yes. They would have all received direct materials as we started them this period. And again, it tells us all direct material was placed in process at the beginning of the production, which in this case was the beginning of this period. So all 640. What about conversion costs? What about the direct labor and factory overheads? Well, they tell us that 45% of these items or units are in process at the end of the period, and 45% of them are complete. What does that mean, complete? The 45% complete means that these 45% have been applied direct labor and factory overheads or conversion costs already, and thus they're completed, right? Because direct material was always placed in the beginning, and through this period, we applied enough direct labor and factory overheads to complete 45% of them. Thus, that's the conversion cost. Those are the units that have already been converted. How many again? 45%. So this time, we want to take the number of whole units and multiply that by the amount that has been completed, or 288 units have been completed with respect to conversion costs. All of them are completed as far as direct material is concerned, but 288 out of them have been completed with respect to conversion costs. Now we simply need to add up each of these columns. Just using the AutoSum function. And basically they tell us at the end that all of the units that were accounted for in this quarter, 16,000 of them are complete as to the direct or added. 16,000 units were added direct material, and 16,233 units were given conversion costs. That's how they help us understand what happened with units in total. Now that we have determined the number of units that received direct material and number of units that received conversion costs this period, we can now begin to determine what was the cost per equivalent unit. Let's start with the total cost for the period in the assembly department. This is given to us up here. They tell us that the total cost for a period in assembly department was $336,000 as far as direct materials were concerned. And that's all they're asking us for in this cell. So I'm just simply going to jot that down. $336,000. They also ask us for the total cost of for period in assembly department pertaining to direct labor and factory overheads, aka conversion cost. And again, they tell us that information up here. Direct labor was added in work in process as a debit to 101,380. Remember, the credit would have been to wages payable or something and debited work in process. And so we can assume that 101,380 was the direct labor cost. And we can also see that the factory overhead added this time was 93,416. So the addition of those two items, 101,380 plus 93,416, were the total conversion costs incurred during this period. Now we know exactly how many units from above pertain to direct material. And this one would have been the same thing, so I'm just going to copy that guy here. And if you were to take the total costs incurred for direct material and divide them by the amount of units we apply direct materials to, in this case 16,000, we should be able to determine the cost per equivalent unit. And that would simply be these two items divided together, and similarly these two items divided together. Part D asks us to determine the cost of units started and completed during the period. Well, the items started and completed during the period was 15,360. Now we know that there are 15,360 units, and the direct material cost per unit was $21, and the conversion cost per unit was $12. And so the total cost of production was $506,880 in this period for units that were started and completed during the period. All right, so I hope this helps you navigate this question and determine why we're separating out the whole units in these two separate columns. And the simple reason is, out of these units, not all were applied conversion cost and not all were applied direct material. And we needed to know that because those are the costs that were given to us. Once we were able to determine those costs, we were able to determine the total cost per equivalent unit we incurred. And then we could apply that logic to any of these items. We could determine the cost for items transferred to finished goods. We can apply this new information of total cost for all inventory in process at the end of the period. And we can apply the same logic for the total cost per equivalent unit to the cost of units started and completed during this period, which we just did. So I hope this helped you out. Of course, reach out if you have any questions. I will continue to help you out and make these videos. I hope they help. Thanks. Have a nice day.